So this paper is part of a broader project that I'm working on called Segregated Sundays, Why 11 a.m. Sunday Morning is the Most Segregated Hour in America. And this book will discuss the pervasive segregation in American worship to the present. So as a result, I've had to look at and think about the theology that whites have used to justify segregation. In the antebellum period, the arguments were mostly biblical. They were the curse of Ham, the mark of Cain. And so African Americans who were responding to these arguments also responded with a very rigorous sort of biblical argument. If you look at the work of, for example, David Walker, in David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, or to Mariah Stewart, who I wrote about, what you find is a very rigorous biblical argument against slavery and in response to it. They use texts like Psalm 68:31, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands to God. In the 19th and 20th centuries, after the Civil War, the argument becomes more pseudoscientific. And it is an argument that African Americans, that Blacks are genetically inferior. They weren't using the term genetic, but that they were inferior biologically. Eventually, with the emergence of eugenics and other movements, this is the argument, essentially that Black people pollute the gene pool. And so segregation was necessary to keep the damage that was being done. So this is the motivation for anti-miscegenation laws, for example, that prevented cross-racial marriage and relationships. And so Blacks responded with examples about Black physical and moral excellence. So this is the argument for, say, Jesse Owens, right? Or for Rosa Parks. And this is, this is the way that people responded. Now that we understand DNA and the Human Genome Project, of course, we understand that humans are nearly identical biologically, and that what we've understood as race really isn't biologically or genetically valid. For example, there's no gene marker for any specific race that isn't also found in other races. There's no single gene or pairs of genes, right? So now that the pseudoscientific explanation has been blown up and the civil rights movement has made the use of overt racism unpalatable, it seems to me that the defense that's being used, the defense of segregation, the theology of segregation, has become increasingly a political one. Beginning with the civil rights movement, political activism, and particularly anti-racism work, divided Black and white evangelicals. Just a small note, in the 1960 election, Black and white evangelicals' voting patterns were almost identical. Interestingly, they supported Nixon. There was suspicion about John F. Kennedy because of his Roman Catholicism. But by 1964, Black and white evangelicals are voting diametrically differently, at least in part because of the civil rights movement and the ways that it galvanizes African-American evangelicals to become politically active. Ultimately, what emerges as the religious right, however, is in some ways a reaction against the civil rights movement. Indeed, Randall Balmer, the historian at Dartmouth, argues that the religious right emerged, at least initially, in defense of segregation. It was in the defense of Bob Jones University and the protection of Bob Jones's tax-exempt status that the religious right emerges, Balmer argues. He argues that although some of the early leaders of the religious right tried to get traction with abortion, they weren't able to. But the religious right galvanizes around segregation in education. Right? In the past, we've responded to what is a theology of segregation by having to answer it. And so this project for me is about teasing out the ways that politics is being used to articulate a kind of theology of segregation in the age of Donald Trump. I'm just at the beginning of this project, but I'm hopeful that our conversation today will help me to think about this and to address the issues and questions there. Churches in the U.S. are hyper-segregated by race and even more racially segregated than the neighborhoods surrounding them. This hypersegregation has stubbornly persisted even as predominantly white congregations and denominations insist in their public pronouncements that their goal is to become more racially diverse. In the period between the end of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, white preachers openly preached that Blacks were inferior to whites and that racial segregation was God's divine order. However, as the Civil Rights Movement made such overtly racist ideology increasingly untenable, churches began to use less overt means to discourage Blacks from joining predominantly white congregations. Increasingly, white churches have used conservative politics to screen minorities seeking membership. Those minorities willing to accept conservative politics are accepted. Those unwilling to accept conservative politics are rejected. These divisions have only widened since the election of Donald Trump as president. In September of 2018, a group of evangelical pastors and leaders, led by conservative pastor John MacArthur, issued the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel, which declared advocating for social justice and for racial justice as antithetical to the Christian gospel. The debate this document has stirred highlights the continuing divisions between Black and white Christians on issues of race. In this paper, I will examine the use of a theology derived from conservative politics as a means of maintaining racial segregation and power in evangelical churches, paying particular attention to the role of the recent Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel in exacerbating the divide between white Christians and Christians of color. Rather than inviting people of color into dialogues over race, the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel declares issues of race, equity, and social justice to be secondary concerns which distract from the authentic preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's a remark often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. decrying the sad fact that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. In the more than 50 years since King proclaimed his dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, little has changed. Churches in the U.S. remain overwhelmingly segregated, and very little progress has been made in transforming communion tables around the country into tables of real interracial brother and sisterhood. According to figures compiled by the Lilly Endowment-funded Congregations Project at Rice University, where a mixed congregation is defined as one with at least 20% of its members providing racial or ethnic diversity. Mixed churches are a rare breed in America, accounting for only 8% of U.S. congregations. Racial segregation in America's churches is neither accidental nor benign, but instead is the result of racist policies and theologies that whites have ruthlessly applied and maintained. Black-only congregations have tended historically to be the consequence of Blacks' reactions to whites' actions, to expel them, to control them, or to relegate them to subservient status in church and in society. Despite the progress Americans have made in desegregating other sectors of society, churches remain rigidly segregated by race. Whites have resisted integrating their churches throughout most of American history, and Blacks have responded to this rejection by creating their own separate religious institutions. In their book, People of the Dream, Multiracial Congregations in the United States, Michael O. Emerson and Rodney Wu compare the racial segregation found in American neighborhoods to the racial segregation typically found in American churches using what they call an index of dissimilarity. According to this index, Emerson and Wu identified an extremely high level of segregation in American churches. Comparing residential segregation in cities to racial segregation in churches, they note that church segregation exceeds that of America's most segregated residential areas. Emerson and Wu further observe that residential segregation of the most segregated American cities required laws, discriminatory lending, and real estate procedures, threats, and other racially unequal practices, but that Catholicism and mainline Protestantism approach these extreme values of the most segregated American cities, and conservative Protestantism actually exceeds these values. In the context of millions of people making choices year after year about which congregation to attend, such segregation values are astonishing. As a result of these findings, the authors conclude that congregations in the United States are hyper-segregated. The average level of racial diversity in the congregations is near zero, and the average level of segregation between congregations is nearly perfect. In answer to those who would blame segregated neighborhoods for the segregation found in churches, they add that nearly all of the congregations are substantially more segregated than the neighborhoods in which they reside. These findings suggest that the level of segregation in churches in the U.S. cannot be accidental, but must have been enforced by mechanisms at least as consistent and coercive as those that produced patterns of residential segregation in American cities. Historically, residential segregation and school segregation have decreased in response to public engagement, advocacy efforts, and legislative changes. Churches, on the other hand, are voluntary associations protected by the Bill of Rights from the sorts of legal interventions that interdicted segregation elsewhere in society. It is not possible to force a church to integrate. Even congregations that wish to desegregate voluntarily find the going hard. One of the best examples of how difficult it is to desegregate a Christian congregation is found in the phenomenon of the kneel-in. Once a fixture of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, these nonviolent integration efforts were forgotten in favor of more successful efforts to integrate lunch counters, local buses, or interstate transit. Documenting the multiracial groups of students who attempted to integrate white churches in Memphis in 1964 and 65, Stephen Haynes wrote The Last Segregated Hour, The Memphis Kneel-Ins and the Campaign for Southern Church Desegregation, which details why these efforts have been forgotten. They've been forgotten because they failed. Although the kneel-ins generated the same sorts of horrifying news reports and incendiary white supremacist rhetoric as other aspects of the civil rights movement that succeeded in pricking the conscience of the nation, they did not produce successfully integrated worship in Christian churches in the U.S. Beyond the confrontations with protesters and the descriptions of whites refusing others entrance to their churches, the kneel-ins failed because even if you could get Black bodies inside a segregated white church, you could not force the church's white members to treat those Blacks like Christians, nor could you do anything to make so openly racist a congregation a desirable place for Blacks or anyone committed to interracial fellowship to want to worship there. When Haynes went 50 years later to interview witnesses of the 10-month campaign that took place in Memphis between 1964 and 1965 to desegregate Second Presbyterian Church, he found that people and institutions there were still not over it. For one white student participant in the kneel-ins, Haynes surmised that even a half-century later, the root of his religious trauma was the sobering recognition that men whom he had regarded as spiritual mentors were driven by racist convictions. Yet getting racists to admit that they are not racist is incredibly difficult. Second Presbyterian Church had refused to admit integrated groups of students to its worship services. In fact, the presence of whites attempting to help Blacks gain entrance seems to have been a particularly provocative point for Second Presbyterian. As a result of the negative publicity and controversy, the church's denomination, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., or PCUS, put pressure on Second Presbyterian to admit the students. At the time, church spokesman said the determination to exclude what the local papers were calling biracial groups had nothing to do with race. Rather, it was based solely on the visitor's intention to demonstrate. To this day, church members declare that visitors who sought entry to the church in mixed race groups were not true worshipers. Eventually, the most unrepentant segregationists of Second Presbyterian left to form Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis in 1965. Haynes argues that although members of Independent Presbyterian still seek to veil the church's racist origins in the myth of a noble quest to defend Christian orthodoxy and to resist theological liberalism, the myth mainly salves wounds of institutional dishonor by suppressing the uncomfortable fact that Independent Presbyterian Church was founded by dedicated segregationists. The founding of Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis is an instructive example here. As historian Haynes notes, the congregation was founded by whites unwilling to admit integrated worshipers. Rather than acknowledge their segregationist motives, the founders of the congregation argued that they were simply rejecting the theological liberalism of the integrated groups seeking admission to their worship. They weren't defending racial segregation, they were simply defending theological orthodoxy. The founders of Independent Presbyterian Church insisted that their complaint was with the integrated group's liberalism, not their racial makeup. Stephen Haynes doesn't accept that explanation, and neither do I. Independent Presbyterian Church had developed a theology of segregation intended to maintain the all-white character of their worship. And in 1965, it succeeded. The theology combined a rejection of progressive values like integration and declared such values as anathema to the authentic preaching of the gospel. Recently, theologians have begun to ask why Christian theology has failed so spectacularly to tackle issues of race and the racial divisions in American congregations. Some theologians have concluded that theology must itself be redeemed from its role in supporting and undergirding, or even hiding, white supremacy, white hegemony, and white cultural normativity. J. Cameron Carter, for example, has examined how the discourse of theology aided and abetted the processes by which man came to be viewed as a modern racial being. More specifically, Carter notes that modern racial discourse and practice have their genesis inside Christian theological discourse and missiological practice, which themselves were tied to the practice of empire in the advance of Western civilization. In his award-winning text, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race, Willie James Jennings gives heartbreaking example after example of the ways that theology served empire from the colonial period onward, and in so doing, created racial hierarchies whose legacies linger today. Rather than function as an anti-racism tool, Christian theology has too often operated in support of racism, colonization, land confiscation, slavery, segregation, anti-miscegenation policies, and the like. Carter and Jennings argue, Carter and Jennings argue that before theology can truly be redeemed as an anti-racism tool, its complicity in racism and its concomitant sins must be analyzed and denounced as the heresies they are. On September 4th, 2018, the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel was posted online. It had grown out of a meeting that took place on June 19th, 2018, in a coffee shop in Dallas, Texas, where 14 men had gathered. Having all expressed their growing concern with much of what was taking place within evangelical circles under the banner of social justice, stating their intentions in terms similar to those of the founders of Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis, Tennessee in 1965, the authors of the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel, hereafter the Statement, declared themselves committed to the defense of theological orthodoxy against questionable sociological, psychological, and political theories presently permeating our culture and making inroads into Christ's church. What follows in the statement is a declaration of various theologically conservative viewpoints outside the scope of this paper, including denunciations of gay marriage, homosexual practice, and women pastors. Have mercy. All right. Moving on. The statement also devotes a section to the discussion and defense of complementarianism, the view that God has designed men and women with distinct traits and to fulfill distinct roles. According to the complementarian viewpoint, in marriage, the husband is to lead and the wife to submit to his leadership. And in church, qualified men alone are to lead as pastors, elders, bishops, and to preach and to teach the whole congregation. Although much could be said in response to the statement, in the time remaining, I want to focus on its recommendations with regard to racism. In the statement, the authors devote an entire section to the acknowledgement that racism is a sin. But they reject the prescriptions of postmodern ideologies derived from intersectionality, radical feminism, and critical race theory, declaring that they are not consistent with biblical teaching. Instead, they recommend an entirely biblical approach to the problem of race relations. They argue that competency to teach on any biblical issue for spiritual people comes from nothing other than clear understanding and simple communication of what is revealed in Scripture. While such a biblically based approach might sound appealing at first consideration, it doesn't bear up under close scrutiny. Although a clear understanding and simple communication of what is revealed in Scripture might be appropriate for a Bible study, it would not suffice for a graduate seminar. Those who teach Bible at the graduate level have usually also studied history, biblical languages, and theology, and that knowledge is generally regarded as contributing to the teacher's and the student's understanding of the biblical text. By suggesting a Bible-only approach to the intractable problems of racial inequity and enmity in the U.S., the authors of the statement make an indefensible claim that there is no knowledge outside of Scripture that can be of use here. The authors go further, stating, we emphatically deny that lectures on social issues or activism aimed at reshaping the wider culture are as vital to the life and health of the church as the preaching of the gospel and the exposition of Scripture. Although the wording suggests that such lectures like this are not vital, it really suggests that they are not necessary, since the preaching of the gospel is sufficient. In other words, lectures on social issues cannot, by definition, also be expositions of Scripture. Here, the authors deny the possibility that discussions of such topics can address biblical principles like justice or building community. There's a type of ecclesial hierarchy hidden in these distinctions. Biblical principles can only be preached, but not lectured. The gospel is only preached, not taught. And the authors of the statement reserve to themselves the right to decide what is or is not gospel and who or who may not preach or lecture on it. And yet, the either-or situation they sketch out does not reflect reality. There's room for the preaching of the gospel and for lectures on biblical principles. There's even room for lectures on non-biblical principles that help people live better Christian lives. The statement makes no room for that as a possibility. Certainly, the Bible is central to Christian faith, but the authors of the statement seem to go beyond that, to argue that the Bible is all one needs to know. They seem to reject all knowledge outside of Scripture. Is this rejection to include mathematics? Astronomy? Perhaps the viewpoint of this statement explains the rejection of climate science by some evangelicals. And yet, Whether or not they acknowledge climate change, they'll still be impacted by it. The author's argument casts knowledge found anywhere other than the Bible as suspect. This view not only limits human understanding, it also limits God's revelation. To suggest that God can only be revealed in Scripture is to deny God's revelation in the creation, for example. It is one thing to claim that revelation always harmonizes with Scripture, a point with which I agree. But the authors of the statement are making a far more sweeping pronouncement. They seem to argue that God's revelation is only found in Scripture. Would the authors reject the study of history as quickly as they have rejected critical race theory? They seem to. Or perhaps their knowledge of history is limited because at another point, the authors deny that systematic racism is in any way compatible with the core principles of historic evangelical convictions. And yet people who have claimed historic evangelical convictions and beliefs supported racist systems like slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, laws against mixed marriage, and today support immigrant family separations on the southern US border. Their evangelical convictions did not prevent them from participating in activities in centuries past that we today clearly identify as racist. But the authors of the statement argue that true evangelicals are free from racism. How would they know? Using only revelations found in Scripture, but rejecting the insights of other fields of study, how can the authors of this statement begin to address racism? The word's not found in Scripture, so even their definition of the term is extra-biblical. How can the consequences of historic inequality be rightly addressed without the insights of economics, politics, sociology, history, psychology, or any number of other disciplines? It's interesting to compare the approach the statement takes to one extra-biblical idea, racism, as compared to another extra-biblical idea, abortion. In a section entitled "The Church," the statement repudiates political or social activism. We deny that political or social activism should be viewed as integral components of the gospel or primary to the mission of the church. However, evangelical churches and leaders have long argued that pro-life activism and voting is central to the mission of the church, and have encouraged faithful believers to prioritize pro-life perspectives to the exclusion of all other issues, particularly when they vote. In the absence of a broader enumeration of their motivations, one can only speculate as to why the authors of the statement argue that racism is a sin, but reject any political or social action to undo it, or to study or understand it. However, it's noteworthy that their approach to abortion, which they also regard as a sin, has given rise to endless studies, organizations, protests, both legal and illegal, and to a long history of political and social interaction and agitation. The difference between the recommendations evangelicals regularly make to resist abortion and the recommendation that the authors of the statement make regarding racism is telling. Racism is a sin that is not to be studied, protested, or lectured about. It is just to be repented of. How's that working so far? Let's address one final claim of the statement. Denying that the contemporary evangelical movement has any deliberate agenda to elevate one ethnic group or subjugate another. By taking racism off the table as a legitimate topic of discussion, the authors of the statement assure that the status quo will prevail. In this way, the statement is truly a conservative manifesto. It seeks to conserve the social order as it is and to prevent disruptions. And yet, in acknowledging that racism is a sin, the statement has already conceded that a disruption has occurred. Rather than to promote movement towards an eschatological vision of racial comedy, harmony, and equality, the statement rejects any means of redress of the historical or present divisions in the thoroughly segregated American church. Historian Ibram Kendi wrote this: For nearly 600 years, some of the best trained minds in Western Europe and the American colonies and the United States have been trying to prove that white people have been on the winning and prospering and living end of Western society, not because of racial discrimination, but because they are superior. For nearly 600 years, some of the best trained minds have been trying to prove that Black people have been on the losing and impoverishing and dying end of Western society, not because of racial discrimination, but because they are inferior. You should know that there are only two ways to explain racial inequalities and disparities. There are only two ways to explain why Black people were enslaved and white people were free. There are only two ways to explain why young Black men are 21 times more likely to be killed by the police than their white counterparts. Either there is something wrong with Black people, which is a racist idea, or there is something wrong with society, which is racial discrimination. Either there is something wrong with Black people, or there is something wrong with society. Kendi argues that throughout American history, Americans dove into the false waters of racist ideas because they do not want to face the reality of racial discrimination. It seems to me that the authors of the statement dove into the false waters of racist ideas when they rejected any prophetic teaching on racism. Rather than be delivered from their racism, they've rejected the source of their deliverance because it makes them uncomfortable. Rather than be like the Berean Christians who studied to know if these things were true, Acts 17:11, they've preferred the existing social order, which, interestingly, leaves their privilege and the spoils of generations of racial inequality they have reaped untouched. They've preferred their own comfort over others. In 2016, Robert Jones published The End of White Christian America, which documents the decline of white mainline denominations and white evangelical churches. Jones argues that the future of Christianity in America will be racially diverse, even as he notes that white Christians no longer make up the majority of American Christians. Documents like this statement suggest that some white Christians would rather let their movement die than listen to the concerns of Christians of color. American churches are hyper-segregated and stubbornly so. Historically, these divisions were justified by scripture and pseudoscience. Since the civil rights movement, politics has provided a powerful means of separating Black and white Christians. Both the examples of the Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1960s and the statement on social justice and the gospel this year represent conservative evangelical repudiations of liberal political anti-racist work as theologically heterodox and have used accusations that anti-racist work is liberal as an excuse to reject it. However, I, for one, am left to wonder if these justifications represent real reservations or simply function to maintain the racial divisions that already exist. Further, I wonder how Christians will ever move past our current racial divisions if one side or another refuses ever to discuss the issues in a meaningful, engaged, and risk-taking way. Thank you.